good to be with you. Last week, Mark started off the message with a question. And the question was, what are you being prepared for? Or what is God preparing you for? And this week, I wanted to follow suit and start off the message with another question. And that question is, do you believe you have a purpose? Do you believe you have a purpose? Mike Foster is a personal development coach and counselor, and he is a Christian as well. And he came up with a mental framework called the 7 Primal Questions. And just like any framework, it is just that. It is a simple framework. But I find it helpful because what he has learned through his years of counseling people is that each person goes into their relationship seeking an answer to a question. And typically, that question went unanswered when they were in childhood. Now, we don't have time to go through all of the questions today, but some of those questions, to give an example, are, am I safe? Am I successful? Am I secure? Am I good enough? Am I loved? And what he found was really interesting is that a question that was most common among people in faith-based homes was the question of, do I have a purpose? And what's really interesting about this is people who grew up in faith-based homes, according to Mike Foster, and if you grew up in a faith-based home, this was likely you heard things said to you like, God has a big purpose on your life. Or God has a wonderful plan on your life. Maybe you've heard Mark or I say things like that to you. Or God is going to do something really big in your life. But what's interesting is a lot of people in faith-based homes, that question went unanswered for them. And so what happens is they go into their different relationships, and when that question is answered no, they start to scramble. And he describes it as scrambling as they start to become really judgmental of themselves. They start to struggle to believe that there really is a calling on their life. Mike Foster calls this calling angst. And so, and they start believing, even though our parents do the best they can, right? They do everything that they know to speak truth and voice things over to them. What happens is kids oftentimes can grow up thinking, man, if I don't sell everything and move to Africa, or if I don't have 1 million followers on Instagram, or if I don't start a podcast and have a lot of influence, then I really don't have a purpose. And so they start discounting the fact that their purpose can be being a mom, or their purpose can be being a parent, or their purpose can be a faithful apprentice of Jesus, that can be purposeful in their life. And so when that question is gone unanswered, and when that question is said no, they fear that their life is without meaning, without purpose, and without significance. We are in the midst of a series right now, as Mark mentioned, called Courage, and we've been studying the life of Moses. And 2 weeks ago, as we kicked off this series, Mark talked about how the providence of God was just all over Moses' life, and it was a foreshadowing that the providence of God is on our lives too. And last week, Mark talked about how God was in the process of preparing Moses for the calling that he had for him. And this week, today, we're going to see throughout the life of Moses that he spent much of his life, and I say this with so much compassion because I see myself in this. It's so easy for us. He spent much of his life scrambling, wondering if he had a purpose. And God's way of answering this, he answers this when he combats Moses with the fear that he's having. So he says that there is an answer to the question of, do I have a purpose? And the answer is an emphatic yes. And we'll see this in the conversation that God has with Moses. Now, as Mark mentioned, this is in Exodus chapter 3, and this is a very famous passage. Even if you didn't grow up in church, it's the burning bush passage. And, it's easy sometimes when we have heard a story over and over again to just kind of glaze over it. But my encouragement to you is to take a step back and think about yourself in the life of Moses, and think about yourself as having this kind of conversation with God, because likely it is familiar to you. So if you have a Bible, you can turn with me to Exodus chapter 3. If you don't have a Bible, it'll be on the screen. I am going to read all of chapter 3, so I'm going to take a sip of my water here, because it is a little lengthy, but hang with me because it's just too good to glaze over. So here we go. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And God said, I will be with you. And this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. Moses said to God, suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of the fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? Then what shall I tell them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, say to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, the name you shall call me from generation to generation. Go, assemble the elders of Israel and say to them, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, appeared to me and said, I have watched over you and have seen what has been done to you in Egypt, and I have promised to bring you up out of your misery in Egypt into the land of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, a land flowing with milk and honey. The elders of Israel will listen to you. Then you and the elders are to go to the king of Egypt and say to him, 'The Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us. Let us take a 3-day journey into the wilderness to offer sacrifices to the Lord our God. But I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless a mighty hand compels him. So I will stretch out my hand and strike the Egyptians with all the wonders that I will perform among them. After that, he will let you go. And I will make the Egyptians favorably disposed toward this people, so that when you leave, you will not go empty-handed. Every woman is to ask her neighbor and any woman living in her house for articles of silver and gold and for clothing, which you will put on your sons and daughters, and so you will plunder the Egyptians.'" So as we unpack this famous conversation between Moses and God, I want you to see how Moses seeks to answer the question of, do I have a purpose, with a no. And this is out of his own fear. And there's 3 fears that I want to focus on today. The first core fear of Moses is being known. Did you notice what happened when the Lord came close to Moses and revealed himself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? He hid. Now, when we think of Moses' life, this would be typical of his behavior, right? Because as we've learned the past couple of weeks, Moses' life was spent in hiding. When Pharaoh gave an order for every Hebrew boy to be thrown into the Nile, his mother hid him in a papyrus basket to save his life on the Nile. When he grew up in the palace under Pharaoh, he saw a fellow Hebrew being beaten by an Egyptian. And we heard last week that he kills the Egyptian and he hides the Egyptian in the sand. And then Pharaoh hears of this. And so Moses runs and hides to Midian. And then he settles in the wilderness of Midian, mind you, for 40 years. He gets married to Jethro's daughter, Zipporah. And so here we are again. Moses comes face to face with God, and his first response is to hide. I think we have all been there. Have you? Isn't it amazing how common hiding is? We see this at the beginning of creation. Adam and Eve in their sin hid from God. Some of you have children or dogs like I do, and then when they do something wrong, what do? They hide. This is what my dog does. And she has found the staircase is a great hiding place for her. I think it looks like a jail cell. But so others of you, sometimes hiding could be just not responding. So you know the family group text? The family group text where it's just like there's 1 to 2 people who just don't respond. They turn their notifications off on the family group text. I have one of those in my family. Sometimes hiding can be healthy. For you, it could be that maybe you don't answer your email at a particular time of night, or you don't pick up the phone because you want to use that time to spend time with your family or your spouse. These aspects of hiding can be healthy, but when we think of Moses, I can't help but think if Moses hid out of his own pain. We saw in chapter 2 how he felt like he constantly did not belong. He was a Hebrew growing up in a land of Egypt. He wasn't raised by his biological parents. And then he moves from a palace to the wilderness of Midian. Talk about culture shock. And then he names Gershom his son, which means exile or stranger. Do you see the pattern of hiding? Sometimes it's easier just to hide than to become known. I wonder how hiding manifests for you. Maybe it's hiding behind a screen, or it's hiding in your work, or it's hiding in Netflix, or it's hiding just being busy. I wonder how you might be hiding. What I love about how God responds to Moses in his hiding is that he catches his attention. He takes something that to Moses would not have been that remarkable, okay? He spent 40 years in the wilderness. It wouldn't have been that remarkable to see a burning bush in the desert. It would be like seeing deer in the back roads of Pennsylvania. It's very common for us. Snow seems a little more remarkable these days, right? But so God reveals something to him, and something that he is used to seeing, something that he has seen thousands of times, and then he does something really interesting. He waits for Moses to turn towards the bush, and he realizes something, that this bush is on fire, but it's not being consumed. It's kind of like staring at someone, when you have been walking down the street. Kim Mecca and I did this earlier this morning, just walking down the street, you're staring at them and you realize you know them, right? Oh, hey. Or you have the same conversation with someone over and over and over again, and then suddenly it makes sense to you. Or maybe how you came to faith was you had heard the stories, you had read the Bible, you had heard these sticky phrases, and then suddenly God just made himself real to you. Suddenly he catches your attention. Recently, my small group did a white elephant gift exchange at Christmas time, and I won an amaryllis plant you can see on the screen. And this is my first amaryllis plant. And what's really cool about this gift, thank you, Noelle, is that I've really kind of gotten into gardening. Now, don't ask me any questions about it, okay, because I'm a total amateur, but it has been very therapeutic for me since I bought my house a few years ago, just to spend some time outside. And what is so interesting about an amaryllis plant, which is probably familiar to many of you, it was not familiar to me, is that the care instructions on this are no water needed. Simply take them out of the box and place them on a tabletop or any other flat surface in your home. Keep your amaryllis in a well-lit room, but avoid direct sunlight. So I found this very interesting because as someone who is used to killing plants, I have been learning, just the right fertilizer and soil and what plants do well in the sun and all of this. And so I was a little skeptical at first. I got this plant, beginning of December, beginning to mid-December. And so every day I had put it on my kitchen island that gets, some good indirect light in there. And I would come downstairs and look at it and just wonder, what's going to happen? And I was a little bit skeptical. So every day I would come down and it just looked the same. And what's really interesting is that throughout this time, God had been speaking to me, because anyone who knows me well knows that I have a tendency to like to want to move fast. I like moving fast. I like juggling a lot of different things. And rest has been something that God has really had to work on me. And so what's been really cool to see is that with a little bit of time, suddenly the plant starts to bloom. And all you have to do is simply turn it a little bit each day. And it's been this reminder for me, particularly as we enter into a new year, right? Like for people in my temperament, New Year is like, yes, clean slate, right? Set all the goals. And God's like, I give you gum surgery, okay? Which is what I had 2 weeks ago. And so I eased into 2024. And so it's just been this ongoing process in my spiritual formation of God just having to slow me down. And this plant has just been this reminder, as John 15 says, that God is the gardener, that he is the vine dresser, that he is the one who tends and prunes, and that sometimes he just simply asks us to just turn towards him. I have a friend whose daughter is 2 years old, and something that they have been teaching her to do is to look at people in their eyes, straight in the eyes. And so my friend Lane from high school, her daughter Bowen is just so cute, has such a personality. And so she has really taken this literally to look at people in the face, okay? And so what has happened is Lane will hold Bowen, and Lane will start a conversation with other moms or something, and all of a sudden this little hand will come across her chin and just aggressively turn her mom's face to Bowen when Bowen wants her to look at her, right? And so it's just this reminder of like, hey, this is what you taught me to do, so I'm gonna have you look at me, right? And I just love that, because I think that sometimes that's what God does to us, less aggressively, but he just turns our face towards him. How is God trying to get your attention? What's really cool is when Moses turns, that's when God says, Moses, Moses. And God exposes himself. He says, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And then he tells him what he's all about. He says, I've seen the oppression in Egypt, and I'm going to rescue the Israelites, rescue my people, and bring them in to the promised land. And I am sending you. Some of us, I think we spend so much of our time, as Mike Foster said, just like scrambling, wondering if God really has a purpose for us, or if it's just preserved for certain people. And God's saying, would you just turn towards me? Would you just turn? Have you let him turn you? Core fear number 2 is Moses' fear of rejection. So God exposes himself. He tells him his intentions to deliver his people from the sufferings of Pharaoh. And then Moses responds with questions and resistance and skepticism. Moses starts questioning God. He says, who am I? And what do I say? What do I say when they ask me about who you are? And later on in chapter 4, which we didn't read, but we'll see that Moses says, what if they don't believe me? So do you hear? It's like, who am I? And who are you? And how am I going to describe who you are to them? And then what if they don't believe me? I'm so guilty of that, all these questions of, sometimes I think that we can trick ourselves in saying that we're just trying to over-prepare for the thing that God has called us to, and yet it's actually kind of this hypervigilance, or maybe this anxiety of we work longer hours because we're just so afraid that we might say something wrong in this presentation that we have, or we need to know all the right answers before we say yes to something, or we spend so much time trying to capture that right image for Instagram with all the filters, and now there's music, and it's just exhausting. Like, there's so many things, and it's not bad to be prepared. It's not bad to post things on social media, but what's interesting is that a core fear of rejection is setting ourselves up just to worship the approval of others. And I love how God responds to Moses' fear. Moses says, who am I? And God says, I will be with you. Moses says, what shall I say to them about you? And this is what God says. He says, I am who I am. You tell them I am sent you. And Moses is like, what? I am sent you. Say to the Israelites, the Lord sent you. Now, this is hugely significant. This is what a theological term would call a theophany, which means a divine revelation of God. The Lord means Yahweh. It means, what it means is I have always been and I will always be. And so God is telling Moses, you go to a group of people who are raised in a polytheistic culture, a culture where they are used to worshiping all these different gods, and you tell them that the one true God sent you. No one existed before him. He's not dependent on anyone. He always has been, and he always will be. They may ask you who you are, but you tell them who I am. That's what he's saying. He's saying, I am sent you. I sent you. When my brother was about 7 years old, he was invited to go with all of the other cousins to South Texas to I think it was like Galveston to beach, and he's a little bit older than me, so I didn't go. I'm not bitter about it. It's okay. It's been over 30 years. So he went with all of the cousins, and it's a long, Texas, like Pennsylvania, is a very large state, okay? So the drive is very long. I think my parents dropped him off, and so my grandparents, decided and my parents said, okay, it could be kind of fun. My brother was very inquisitive, very independent, for him to fly back from San Antonio to Dallas. And that over 30 years ago, this was a different time, okay? You basically pull up to the airport, hop out of the car, and walk on the plane, okay? It was like very simple to do. But they get to the airport, and they had a ticket, but there was some issue with, my brother didn't have an ID, obviously, and so my grandparents are talking to the TSA agent, and my brother was eavesdropping. And there's, who is he? We got to figure out, and so my brother overhears this, and he says, wait a second, you know who my dad is, don't you? And my grandparents look at my brother, and they're like, no, honey, they don't know who your dad is. He said, my dad is Patrick Short. Just tell them who my dad is. And if you've met my dad through the years, through the history of 938, there's so much about this that makes sense in our family system. But we love that story in our family because I think about it when it connects to Moses, right? Because what if we were just that confident about our Heavenly Father? It's okay. They may reject me. They may question me. They probably won't accept me, but it's okay. I'll just tell them who my dad is. I'll just tell them who my dad is. Jesus foreshadows in Matthew 10 to his disciples that he says, you will be brought before governors and kings as witnesses to them and to the Gentiles, but when they arrest you, do not worry what to say or how to say it. At that time, you will be given what to say, for it will not be you speaking, but the Spirit of your Father speaking through you. For someone who is a recovering addict of the approval of others, there is so much hope that I find in this passage, because it's God saying, they may question you and they may reject you, but I accept you. You have my approval. You have my approval because of Jesus, because I am sent you, because you are my daughter, you are my son. And lastly, core fear number 3 of Moses is a lack of ability. In chapter 4, God does a demonstration with Moses because Moses asked, well, what if they don't believe me? And so what God does is he says, pick up your staff and throw it on the ground. So he does that, and it turns into a snake, and Moses runs, which that's exactly what I have done, because snakes are from the pit of hell, okay? And so then God says, now pick up the snake from its tail. And that's when I would have said, send someone else, okay? And but he does it. He picks up the snake from the tail, and it turns back into a staff. And then God says, well, if they don't believe you for that, then take your hand and put it inside your cloak. So he does that, and he pulls his hand back out, and his hand turns leprous, and then he puts his hand back in the cloak through God's instruction, and then he brings it back out, and his hand is clean. And then God says, if they don't believe you from the first sign, they don't believe you from the second sign, then what I want you to do is I want you to take water from the Nile and throw it on the ground, and it'll turn to blood. And then Moses says, after all of that, but Lord, I'm not eloquent. I'm not good at speaking. Moses, like most of America, is scared to speak publicly, and as someone who is standing up here right now, I totally get it. But what's so interesting is that Moses is constantly looking for this way out based off of his own performance. Have you done that? I'm not smart enough. I'm not young enough. I'm not old enough. I'm not eloquent enough. I don't know enough. And then so what God does, God confronts Moses, and he says, who made your mouth? Who gave human beings their mouths? Who gave sight to the blind? He says, I will teach you what to say. And then Moses says, just send someone else. And that's when God's like, fine, Aaron, your brother, can go with you. And I'm going to speak through you to Aaron, to the people. But God still sends Moses. And it's just such a picture that God does best in our weaknesses, doesn't he? In the things that we feel ill-equipped to do, even when we question him, even when we feel rejected, even when we feel that it's too scary to be known, even when we've spent our life hiding. Moses, it was his 40 years. He was 40 years old when he fled to Midian, and then 40 years after that was when God appeared to him. You just think of the time. I mean, God breaks down so much in this scenario because you and I, we're not smart enough, we're not old enough, we're not young enough, we're not eloquent enough, but God does his best work with people who feel ill-equipped and ill-prepared because they're totally dependent on on Yahweh, who always has been and who always will be. So you and I don't have to have calling angst, and we don't have to scramble, because Jesus, he did the work for us, and he has a plan tailor-made for you. The prophet Jeremiah says, I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future. Let's pray.